of the Emmy-winning show, Bill Nye, the Science Guy. Sorry. He,
Love that song. We love that song.
he has inspired generations through accessible, engaging science education and is a leading advocate for science literacy, particularly on climate change and evolution. In 2025, he was awarded Presidential Medal of Freedom. Dr. Nye currently serves as the CEO of the Planetary Society. And Ms. Liza Mundy is an award-winning journalist and New York Times bestselling author known for bringing untold stories in American history to light. Her recent book, The Sisterhood, The Secret History of Women at the CIA, 2023, follows the success of Code Girls, which revealed the crucial role of women codebreakers in World War II. She's also the author of Michelle, a biography and a 2008 bestseller about former First Lady Michelle Obama. So thank you for joining me today. I want to show a quick video about Girls Talk STEM, which is right behind you, and then we can get started with the session. Thank you. Can the video be played?
We're in the mirror, man.
There we go. Maybe it doesn't work so well. Yes.
That was quick.
Yes. So thank you for joining me today. So today we're talking about science and stardom and how they combine together. So I want to start off with Dr. Bill Nye. How did you first realize that science needed a showbiz makeover? Because many of us here know you for being Bill Nye, the Science Guy. So why is it important that you build a brand that millions of kids, including me, trust?
Well, trust comes with authenticity. And our goal in teaching science or in studying science is to try to find out things that are objectively true. So I am of a certain age, and I'm from the United States, as you may infer, and I'm a mechanical engineer. I became a mechanical engineer because I like bicycles and airplanes. And I thought they were cool and fun. And then the United States produced some of the worst vehicles ever conceived on an assembly line. The Ford Pinto and the Chevy Vega. These were terrible cars. And it's still going on in the United States. People say, why can't we sell US-built cars in Europe? Because European consumers don't want them, which is a drawback. And so these two cars had a tremendous influence on me. I worked on this fighter plane and this and that. And I realized that I felt that U.S. Science, technology, and engineering was falling behind. And so we had this very compelling research that 10 years old is about as old as you can be to get this so-called lifelong passion for science. And if it's not 10 years old, it's 11, it's 12, it's not 27. That's water under the bridge, as the old saying goes. And so I decided, or we worked to focus a television show on people who are 10 years old by presenting the fundamentals of science. This is scientific ideas and concepts that everyone should be familiar with. As I like to say, we don't want everyone to become a scientist. We certainly don't want everyone to become an engineer. The fashion problems alone with that would be really troubling. So we want everybody to be scientifically literate, and that was the objective of the old show. Thank you.
That's amazing. And Miss Liza, you have written so many books about bringing untold stories about women in American history to light. And why is it important to make scientists, especially women scientists, code breakers, visible in mainstream stories? And as a writer, what made you choose a topic and putting women in the spotlight?
Well, I've written about gender and women issues for much of my career. And I think that for girls going into STEM and young women going into STEM, it's really important to know that women, in many ways, pioneered the field of STEM. So much of our STEM technology was developed during World War II, which is what I write about in Code Girls, and it was often for military purposes, for weapons technology, for calculating ballistics and trajectories, weapon trajectories. Radar was developed, and much of our computer science began during World War II. You might have heard of Admiral Grace Hopper. She was a Navy officer who helped program the Navy's first computer, the Mark 1 and 2 computers, and similarly, and it was because World War II was a total global war, and the men were all fighting. And so it was this terrible and yet sort of wonderful moment in American history in particular, when women for the first time were not just recruited into the workforce, but competed for avidly by the U.S. military. The Army and the Navy both had code-breaking operations, and this was early computer work. A lot of it was mathematical. All of the militaries, all of the diplomats and politicians during World War II were sending messages to each other, just the way you do now. I mean, think of how many messages you send every day through the airwaves. This was happening during the war in order to plan attacks, right? To plan enemy movements, and all of that information was what we would call encrypted. And the United States military and other militaries needed what we would today call hackers. And so early coding had to be done. The technology developed, and often it was pencil and paper, and this was done by thousands. Ultimately, more than 10,000 American women were doing this work. So, you know, particularly in this day and time when DEI is suddenly regarded by some as a bad thing, as a way to elevate unqualified people, it's important to look back, say, at World War II to understand that what DEI was, what inclusion was a way to tap all these different talent pools that had not been tapped. And so you had the Navajo code talkers, right? You had Navajo men in the Pacific using their native language to encrypt our communications and keep soldiers safe. You had the Tuskegee Airmen, black men who were fighter bomber pilots, and you had women who were pioneering and designing all of these new technologies that we still use today, that are still relevant today. Encrypted communications, right? Everybody's communications are encrypted, we hope, often. And so I think it's incredible to me that we have to keep establishing ourselves in this field, or keep making this argument that DEI, for example, isn't about elevating unqualified people. It's about tapping all of your talent pools. So it's important to be reminded that one reason we won that war is because the Allies were inclusive.
Mention the Battle of Midway.
Okay. The Battle of Midway was one of the most famous sea battles in the world, and in history, and it turned upon the Japanese Navy, which had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor with the intention of finishing off our Pacific fleet. That was the point of the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, was to completely destroy the American fleet. But some of the important ships, the aircraft carriers, were out of the harbor. So it wasn't a complete destruction. And so Midway, the Battle of Midway 6 months later, was an attempt by the Japanese Navy to finish us off. And but American code breakers broke into the messages that were planning that attack so that the U.S. Navy could be in place at the atoll of Midway to ambush the ambushers. They were lying in wait for the Japanese. And the reason we were able to break that code system was because a woman named Agnes Driscoll had spent the 1930s studying Japanese messages, understanding this very complicated mathematical, it was called super encipherment, super encrypted system that the Japanese, she reverse engineered it to understand the pattern. She detected certain really faint mathematical patterns that enabled her to understand that code system and teach the men of the U.S. Navy who were working in Hawaii how to break that code system. So there was a woman behind that. I mean, it was obviously a battle that was valiantly fought, and there were casualties, and it was great danger, but there was a woman behind the breaking of that code system.
That's amazing. That actually, I read in your book, Code Girls, also, one of your inspirations was Dr. Bill Nye's mother, who worked in Arlington Hall, right? And that was also one of your inspirations to become a science educator. So tell me a little bit more. That'd be helpful.
Well, what I'll tell you about my mother, I was a little kid, and I'm pretty sure I remember her uniform, her Navy uniform, hanging in the end of the closet. She was in the reserves for a while. But if you asked my mother or her buddies, Gwenny Gaminder, what did you do during the war? I can't talk about it. Ha ha. Can't talk. They never talked about it. There was a reunion in 1992. There were people alive in 1992.
I believe you.
Yeah.
I believe you. I believe you.
And my recollection, there were 6 other women there. There were 7 gals, and my nephew was 12 at the time, and he was trying to do a book report about his grandmother and this and that, and she just wouldn't talk about it. None of them would ever. They just kept their secrets all the way to their graves, and it turns out my wife knows more about what my mom did than I do, and then and she'd have to kill me if she told me, which I'm sure has occurred to you. But the one moment was we were at the Library of Congress in the United States in Washington, D.C., and there was a celebration of the Code Girls, and a woman came up to my brother, sister, and me. We were there and attending this, and she said, "My mom was with your mom in Hawaii." Our mother was never in Hawaii. Well, it turns out she was. She never, somehow the women from Washington, D.C. in this brick building, or these brick buildings, which is across the circle from American University, if you ever go there, were shipped to Hawaii to finish off Japanese naval code breaking. So it's just, they were so secretive. But my mother was, I just say objectively, very good at puzzles. If the family was sitting around doing crossword puzzles or what, she was, and very good at riddles and limericks. She would write limericks, you know, this form of poetry, poetry-ish, poetry adjacent. And apparently she answered an ad in the Baltimore Sun newspaper. She went to college in Baltimore in the United States. And do you like puzzles? Answer this. And so she was recruited.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's how they did it in Bletchley Park in the
So speaking of Bletchley Park, I am wearing the Enigma machine bow tie.
That is awesome. That is absolutely so cool. So I want to get your opinion on this because you guys are talking about history, and I think some of us haven't lived through that time. So what's one pop culture moment you think, film, book, viral story, or show that you think changed the way people see science?
Well, I thought my show was influential. I felt, but I understand. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mr. Wizard.
No.
Don Herbert. Anyone? If you're of a certain age. So Don Herbert was an actor who had a love of science demonstrations, the way some people like magic and stuff. So he was on, in the United States we call CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, in the 1950s and early 1960s. And I used to watch his show. And so we made some changes, but he inspired me. And then I had a fantastic physics teacher in high school, and my older brother had a fantastic different physics teacher in his high school, and all these people influence you. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're asking me? Is there was a television show that influenced me, and I created a television show?
Yeah.
And we're just trying to change the world, people.
Well, I would say more recently that Hidden Figures introduced audiences in a big way. I mean, Hidden Figures started as a book, and it's a wonderful book. And I've done panels with Margot Lee Shetterly, who grew up in that area. And what was so interesting that she said she grew up in Hampton, Virginia, where she knew these women. And she said on the panel with me, you know, I always assumed that that mathematicians were black women, and black women were mathematicians. And it wasn't until she got married and her husband, met her family and got to know the area, he said, no, this is, sort of not generally known, and this would be a really wonderful book project to write. But I think that, the Hidden Figures was just, again, another important untold story about American history and women's and black women's contribution to the space race and the space effort and the safety of those pilots and the astronauts. So I think, and speaking as a book author, I think the success of the book and the movie really helped publishers understand that these were important stories and that it wasn't all, I think in particular prior to Hidden Figures, stories about scientists and mathematicians were movies like A Beautiful Mind or The Imitation Game. They were about these brilliant, tortured men who worked alone and had these incredible breakthroughs and then these tragic, deteriorations, or they were treated badly. And so, and ironically enough, that's an easier story to tell as an author because it's just one person and you follow that one person's trajectory, the rise and the fall or whatever. Whereas to tell like a collective story about a group of women or a group of people is sort of sometimes narratively harder. Who are you going to feature? How are you going to balance their narratives? I mean, like rewatch Hidden Figures. It is so well done, balancing the stories of those women and cutting back and forth, and they all work together, but they're all sort of dealing with sort of the same challenges, but also individual challenges. I really admire the structure of that screenplay, but I think that story did a lot to convince people, oh, there really are untold stories in American history, things that we weren't taught that were actually quite important. There really were different people, who did this work, and it also telegraphed to movie executives and to book publishers that there's an audience for these stories and that there is a way to tell them. These stories really have collective genius, because often genius really is a collective endeavor.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that movie is also really good. I watched it. And I think the future of STEM also lives in the stories we tell about the past. Because as you said, the future of computer science and coding and everything else and hackers came from World War II in Arlington Hall, essentially. So Code Girls uncovered forgotten heroes. And how do we keep on telling those stories?
Well, you're younger than we are. Have at it, man. So the stories of science are often feature individuals. And that's a worthy thing, because I had not thought about that very deeply. That the story of Irene Curie and Leavitt, the Cepheid variables, what's her first name? The astronomer that discovered the Cepheid variable stars that enable us to reckon how far away stars are. The individual stories are, or Rosalind Franklin, who probably nominally discovered DNA, and with the famous image 51, where she got a side view of DNA in X-rays, and taking so many X-ray photographs, she got cancer. And
she had the credits. She had the credit stolen from her. I mean, she should have been part of that prize.
You can't get the Nobel.
You can't get it possible.
You can't get it while you're dead.
Yeah.
So that's a rule. But it is tragic. But nevertheless, now we do our best to honor those stories. I was in. Liza was just referring to Langley. This is a NASA center in Virginia, in the Eastern Time Zone in the U.S. Also over there is the Goddard Space Flight Center, and Robert Goddard is in the West, the non-Soviet scientific communities, the guy who invented rocket science. He invented staging rockets, which we all kind of take for granted now, and he wrote the first rocket equation, the rocket equation. And so here's a question: every moment the rocket is burning, the fuel is burning, the rocket weighs less. Right? Every instant of time. And you know how much the payload weighs, the radio or the people. So how much fuel do you start with? Robert Goddard figured it out. Anyway, at the Goddard Space Flight Center, is named after him, is sitting there. I saw it 3 weeks ago. The Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, and she's another astronomer who made remarkable discoveries about the expanding universe and so on. So we're doing our best to honor, well, we are doing something, maybe not our best, to honor women in science. But what I think you're driving at, correct me, is how do we engage young people, young women in, and the answer is, I think, is storytelling. So we're counting on you. What story of science history do you find enchanting?
What story I find enchanting, one of Rosalind Franklin, we studied about her in class and how William and, I forget their names, but...
Watson and Crick?
Yeah. Watson and Crick stole her credit. I think that's incredible, that they shouldn't have done that, first of all. And
but it was the way of the world at that time.
Yeah. Someone disagrees.
Well, but they took her images and they really appropriated her images. I don't think that was the way of the... Well, it happened, but it
Oh, I'm not saying it was good.
Yeah.
No, but it was... like, she couldn't... Correct me if I'm wrong, but she couldn't be a whistleblower in those days, right? It was... She would be
There would have been nobody to blow the whistle to. I think that's right. I mean, that the same way in workplaces 30 years ago, if you were, sexually harassed, there was really nobody to blow the whistle to. So I think that's true. It would have been hard for her to get somebody to listen and pay attention and care that her work was appropriated. That's true. But it was the way of the way of the world. I don't know that.
I blew it.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I guess it was, but
I mean,
yeah.
It's a question that we can...
Well, it was the way of the world also in the sense, like, looking at the story of the Code Girls, what Bill alluded to, that his mom never talked about the work, it was because this was intelligence work as well as technology. And so the women and the men who were doing the work during the war were told, never talk about what you did. This is top secret intelligence. We don't want the Japanese to know that we've broken their code systems. We don't want the Germans to know that we've even broken the Enigma code system. That was the system your mom was working. And so that was true during the war, but and then after the war, they were told, well, now it's the Cold War. We're going to be breaking Russian codes, so we don't want the world to know that we can do this. So they were told to keep quiet even after the war. So they did. But then along about the 1980s, 1990s, the story gets out about code breaking during World War II because it was a big part of the war, and so the men more likely are in public life and they get the message that it's okay to talk about. Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens was a naval codebreaker during the war. That was part of his resume at a certain point in his life when the story got out. But the women were mostly at home. They had become housewives because they had been ushered out of the workforce after the war, and nobody tracked them down and told them, okay, it's okay to talk now. It's okay to tell your story. And so just like nobody told your mom that it was okay now to tell this story. Nobody bothered, and the women took their pledge so seriously. So that goes to what you were saying about Rosalind Franklin as well. Like, there was just sort of nobody to appeal to about this. Like, hey, and some of the women I did interview had sort of gotten the message. They'd seen that books had been published, and they had started to tell in their own families, well, actually, I worked Japanese code system during the war. And their children didn't know whether to believe them. Like, is grandma crazy? And so it's definitely true that for years and years and years, there was just sort of nobody who was listening. So I'm sure that would have happened in Rosalind Franklin's case. So they would have just considered that she was an assistant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess, yeah. But in the case of my mom, I think the other gals I met, they thought, well, that still may be information. There still may be somebody on the other side. If I use the word overlap, right? Whoa, that was some technique, right, that they didn't want to talk about. And you guys, what's going on in the United States with the sloppiness of security is really heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. I think about how hard these gals work to keep secrets, and then these guys are not taking it seriously. It's just really troubling, really troubling.
Yeah. And you talked about storytelling and how storytelling could have helped so many people know about what happened, their legacy, and what could have been possible in those stories and what story Code Girls tells. And Dr. Nye, you've been in the entertainment.
No, you keep calling me Dr. Knight. They're honorary doctorates, you guys. It's very nice. I have a few of them. Thank you.
And you've been working in the entertainment industry almost all your life, right? And I just
Well, about half.
yes. And
No, really, I used to have a job. I was.
yes, of course.
I worked on a drawing board. I worked on 747 airplanes. If you're ever on one, don't worry. I was very well supervised. It's all good. Yes.
So you were half your life in the entertainment industry, and what role can entertainment play in surfacing diverse scientific role models, especially for kids who don't see themselves in textbooks?
So the big thing in science education, you guys, is show then tell. This is a big how to do it phrase. So there's nothing, respectfully, there's nothing like the visual arts, like television or movie, to show stuff. And then the other thing we could do in television is you can go to many places very quickly, like volcanoes. You can go to volcanoes there are extinct volcanoes in Arizona. There's volcanoes in Italy. There's volcanoes in Hawaii. You can go to these places just like that, in a way that a student would, unless he or she were crazy wealthy with time on her hands, couldn't manage. So the storytelling with words and pictures, as the saying goes, is what I got involved in because I feel it's so effective.
Yeah, so since we're coming to a short end with this session, I would appreciate if you could give some advice to young girls, and what message would you give and to writers, creators who want to tell stories?
My message to everybody who's your age is algebra. So algebra has been studied, so-called longitudinal study, where they study people 20 or 30 years of their lives. Algebra apparently not only enables you to think abstractly about numbers, it enables you to think abstractly about all kinds of things. And girls are often, for lack of a better term, allowed to not hustle in algebra. And I'll just tell you, it sucked for me too, okay? You have to practice. There's no substitute for practice. And then everything in conventional science is math related, and everything is related to algebra. You get to your third year of calculus, it's called linear algebra. You're back to algebra again. So that's my advice to you, Liza.
Thank you.
Well, the same advice would be true for writers and researchers. Code Girls was a lot of work, and everything is a lot of work. I mean, going to archives and finding these stories and finding the records that prove that the stories are true. There was no central roster kept of the 10,000 women who did this work during the war. Nobody had bothered to record their names or put it in a central directory. So I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and spent days and really months going back through old records, finding women's names. When they came to Washington, they went through orientation, or they put down their names and addresses, and these were often maiden names. This is one of the hard things about researching women. They joined up under their maiden names. They often got married after the war, sometimes more than once. So I had to plug their names into Ancestry.com to try to get their last names, and then I went on the LexIs database to try to get phone numbers. And these were women in their 90s, and many of them were dead by now. So I would literally sit down and make cold calls to, just hundreds of phone numbers in order to find one person who would answer the phone. Like I literally this, like a 92-year-old woman in an assisted living facility would answer the phone and say hello, and I would say, I found your name in the National Archives, and I think you were a code breaker during the war. Would you mind talking about it? So it's just important to remember, just like algebra, everything is a lot of work. Things that are worth doing are a lot of work. And I think also maybe with social media, and there's the idea I could just be an influencer right away. I could, and maybe that's true. But in my experience, there's a lot of labor, and it's unglamorous, but it's also incredibly exciting when you find that name or when the person answers the call, and you have to be patient and you have to be persistent and resilient in order, I think, to do good work. And it's the same what you're saying about algebra. You just have to persist.
Yeah.
And you have to be willing to fail.
Yeah, that's amazing. And also, I think never be afraid, and you have to be persistent to be able to raise your hand, because sometimes you're always told, keep your hand down, it's okay, your questions are your questions, it's not that important to be answered. And sometimes you shouldn't be that polite about raising your hand. And with that, I want to thank our amazing headline speakers, Dr. Bill Nye and Miss Liza Mundy, for joining us today. Thank you for all of you and in the audience for joining us today. It's an amazing pleasure and honor.
It has been an honor. Thank you.
To be able to host this session. Don't forget to tag World Women Fund on all of your social media posts for this session. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for the next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It was fabulous.